Hello, everyone, and welcome to Open Democracy's live weekly discussion panel. I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. We are an awesome independent media outlet that exists to challenge power and inspire change. We're very excited to be hosting this conversation today about coronavirus and Africa and the restrictions, questions about whether or not the lockdown has been worth it, and lots of other related questions. Just to say, first of all, that we want this conversation to involve you. So thank you to all who submitted questions ahead of time. We're going to try and address as many of them as we can. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can, and you have a question or comment, you can add it in the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining on Facebook, you can add your input and it'll be fed back. I will add the disclaimer that I add every time, which is these are conversations in lockdown or semi-lockdown. There may be unscheduled interruptions from pets, small children, other things that we can't quite fully anticipate. So apologize in advance and bear with us if any of those things happen to you or to any of us. It's my great pleasure to announce this week's chair, Ferial Haffajee, who is the associate editor of the Daily Maverick, which is another awesome independent media outlet based in South Africa. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ferial, to introduce the panel and lead the discussion.
It's lovely to be with you all, and maybe one day we could even meet in real life, but for now it's on Zoom. I'm really happy to be with you. My name's Ferial Haffajee, and we'll be joined by a wonderful panel who I look forward to introducing to you shortly. So what has been really cool for me to see is, for the first time in a world crisis, our continent isn't top of the leaderboards. We don't have runaway pandemic numbers. Obviously, any death is one death too many, but we're not upfront. In fact, we are quite low on the world maps of COVID-19. And the other one is that the story of police brutality is happening around the world, but not really here, although we certainly have big security and violence issues to talk about. And to start us off, it's my great pleasure to welcome Mausi Segun, who is the Executive Director for Africa at Human Rights Watch. Very welcome, Mausi. Now,
Thank you, Ferial.
24 countries have implemented lockdowns. And I was just looking at some statistics which our colleague from Open Democracy prepared, where she said that there have been 85 deaths thus far. And when I looked at a UN study into toxic lockdowns, it made me quite sad that Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa were all right up there. Will you give us a sense of what you've been seeing, and when you make this balancing act, has that been justified action? Can it ever be?
I mean, it's difficult to tell, what is justifiable and what isn't in the face of this very unusual global pandemic. Governments definitely have a responsibility and in international law obligations to protect public health in times like this. But you see, the challenge is that, one, Africa, unlike the rest of the world, at least most parts of the world, especially the Western world, does not have this basket of welfare provisions or packages for the citizens. And so you have very vulnerable groups made even more vulnerable by some of the lockdown measures that have been introduced. I mean, I don't want to diminish, the impact that the lockdown measures have had in curbing the spread of the virus itself. But, it's a double pandemic for poor Africans, for vulnerable Africans. It's the economic pandemic. People locked down at home. We've read stories of a woman, for example, in Kenya, who was boiling something in a pot for several hours until her children slept. And the neighbor eventually ventured to check what was cooking. And it was stones. She deliberately put the stones on the fire to keep the children, to get give them the impression that something was cooking and dinner was coming until they slept off. That's how bad it was for some people in some communities, very low income areas, women and children, women in particular, especially those who've been faced with domestic violence. They have nowhere to go, nowhere to run, nowhere to escape, and nowhere to report. Some countries had to introduce some, easing of the measures to make a special case for women in those kind of categories. And then on top of that, you have, especially in countries with histories of abusive law enforcement, abusive policing, using tactics that are, historical to them with impunity to enforce these lockdowns, including shooting and killing people. We recorded that in Nigeria. Actually, the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria reported that in the first 2 weeks, just the first 2 weeks of the lockdown measures in Nigeria, 18 people had been killed, double the number who had died from the infection itself, for flouting these rules. And we've seen the same in Kenya, in South Africa, homeless people, shot with water cannons, and told to go home when they had nowhere to go. In Uganda, we saw homeless LGBT people who were living in a shelter. They were arrested, 19 of them were arrested and charged with flouting the social distancing rules. They were in a home. Of course, there were more than the number required by law, because it was a shelter for them. And they were charged, and until we intervened and the prosecutor fortunately accepted our plea to drop the charges against them. You can imagine what it was like for them, many of them needing medication that they had no access to during detention. And so it's been a double jeopardy for a lot of people in Africa with these lockdown measures, especially with the way that they have been implemented. Ferial, you're muted.
Yes, I've got it. So thank you very much, Mausi, for those opening remarks. A double jeopardy, a double pandemic. I think that's going to be a common story tonight. Catherine, very, very welcome. Very happy to have you with us. So Catherine Kyobutungi is an epidemiologist and the executive director of the African Population and Health Research Center. Catherine, I wonder if you could help us grapple with this, with the key question we're facing tonight is, so our continent is not right up there. That's for many good reasons. I think we've learned from polio, we've learned from Ebola. In South Africa, we've learned from the HIV and AIDS pandemics about how to manage these things. But on the other hand, you'd have heard Mausi's introduction, where the price has been paid is extremely high, both for livelihoods, but also for the jackboot of police and army violence that people have experienced. What's your view? What's your take on the first sort of 100 days or just over 100 days? And where do you think we're headed? You're on mute, Catherine. There you go.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thanks very much for having me. And my take of where we are, I think I'll echo the points made by Mausi, that this is unprecedented. There's no template. There was no time. And so countries were forced to take actions that were based on what they had seen that had happened in other parts of the world. And also knowing very well what's going on, in our own countries. I don't think countries wanted to take chances to see what would happen if they didn't take the kinds of restrictions that they took. So I think my own take is that in public health, there are trade-offs, and when you do something, it has trade-offs. But on the other hand, that when I think about those trade-offs and the choices that countries have to make, it's not that you lock up people and you protect them from COVID, and then you let them die from other things, because from what we've seen in all parts of the world, I don't think it's possible without lockdown measures at some point in the evolution of the outbreak to get a handle on COVID. So if we assume that a lockdown is inevitable, either very early on, as what most African countries did, or late, as what Italy and the US and other parts of the world were forced to do when things were already out of control, when you look at it from that perspective, if a lockdown is inevitable, then it's the question of at what point does the lockdown come in? You know, in many African countries, it came in early. And then the question is, how do you do it in a way that actually you don't exacerbate those other negative things that come out of the lockdown? So for instance, there are already indications that vaccination programs are getting affected, not only because of the lockdown, but because people are afraid to go to health facilities to get vaccinated. So there are things like family planning access. Women are not getting access to family planning. There are things like obstetric emergencies that, in some cases, travel restrictions. When women want to have obstetric emergencies, they cannot actually access, healthcare. So those are unintended consequences of a lockdown. But on the other hand, you could assume that if the healthcare system was overrun to the extent that we saw happening in places like Wuhan or like Italy, then the lockdown would still be inevitable and those things would still happen. So I don't think countries have, too many good choices. They have bad choices, and I think they chose maybe the least, the lesser evil from what they did. But of course, having said that, there are many other things which have happened that could have been done differently. For instance, the violence from the police, the lack of planning, for instance, to what to do with people in informal settlements. There are many other things that countries could have done differently, but when it comes to whether to put restrictions or not, I don't think they had too many choices. And so what they've done, I think, was appropriate based on the lack of precedent, the lack of evidence on what would work, but also based on the observation they had made in the countries which were already a little bit further ahead in the epidemic in Europe and Asia. Ferial, back to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I just lost your final sentence there, but important points you raised. Just to give you an update, I was checking, so we're on 210,613 cases across Africa, Catherine, and there have been 5,709 deaths. We're going to move. I can't hear, sorry. We're going to move now to Gilad Isaacs. I see we've lost Catherine for a moment. Gilad is the co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa, really been at the center of tracking the impacts, not only of the lockdown, but of COVID-19, and how you saw almost instantly the impacts of how millions of people lost their livelihoods, and many tens of thousands are likely to have lost their jobs if we track the UIF numbers. Welcome, Gilad, and I believe you have a presentation to show us first.
Excellent, thanks Ferial, and thanks everyone, and to everyone else on this panel. It seems like it's going to be a really interesting evening. So I've been doing work mainly on South Africa, and so I'm going to zoom in there just for like a few minutes, but I think there's some interesting lessons which we can extrapolate from there for other countries. And I just wanted to start quickly, and thanks for allowing me this, just by putting up this one slide here, which gives an illustration of the trajectory of COVID-19 in South Africa. And what we see here is the number of COVID cases. We see that there is a spike at the onset. That spike is mainly South Africans returning from overseas, wealthier, higher income South Africans. There's then the imposition of a hard lockdown from late March, one of the world's hardest lockdowns, and there's a fall in the infection rate. That hard lockdown, it was supposed to last for 3 weeks, it lasts for 5 weeks. It's those two lines there. By the end of the lockdown, the level of infections is roughly at where it was at the peak where the lockdown was instituted. Okay, now unlike in other countries, who have lifted lockdowns in periods where they've already peaked, as we see in a number of these countries. South Africa is still on the way up and has seen a steady increase, despite the fact that we've seen a change in a loosening in these lockdowns. And so my question is really, well, what's happening here? Why is it that we're seeing these lockdown interventions at the same time as we're seeing this steady rate of increase? And for real, when I was grappling with that, what came to mind for me is there's obviously is a whole slew of reasons why, whether it is public health interventions and actions, whether it is behavioral, but what we've really looked at is issues on a policy and economic and a structural level. And in each of these periods, in this lockdown period and in the opening up period, I think you see a intersection of the structural features of South African society and the particular policy choices, which are interacting in a way which is undermining the efficacy of that policy. So in the instance of the lockdown, the structural features are, for example, that a tenth of South Africans or over that live in informal dwellings, right? So in shacks, okay? So if 5 million plus people live in shacks, how does social distancing actually function in that instance, right? There is a structural reality which makes the implementation difficult. At the same time, there is a policy problem there too, in that the South African government failed to institute the types of economic measures necessary to support the livelihoods of individuals and of businesses so they could viably stay at home, whether that is social grants, business support. If you want people to stay home, you have to offer them income in order to do that. So there was a confluence of structural issues in the South African economy and of policy failures, which then undermined the lockdown. We're seeing the same thing with regards to the opening up of the economy, right? Where there's structural features of the South African economy, what we've started to think of as social comorbidities, right? That you're not just at risk because you have an underlying health illness, but you're at risk because you use an overcrowded minibus taxi every day for an hour and a half, right? That's to do with the geographies, the income, the transport networks in South Africa. And so those structural features combined again with policy failures to protect workers, to empower workers, to oversee health and safety measures, to ensure inspections of workplaces. You're again going to see a intersection of the failures on a structural and a policy level, which unfortunately will mean that that trend is only like to increase. I can speak later about why I think that's happening, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very interesting chart, Gilad. So I just want to welcome Professor Samir Hamir, who has got lots of questions, most about Kenya. Also to Evelyn, welcome. To Farouk, welcome. Laura Pawson, and to all our guests, great to be with you. Great to have you with us. So from Prof. Samir Hamir, first to Catherine, I'm going to put the epidemiologist question. He says, let's give real thought to this idea of herd immunity because of the damages that the lockdowns are causing on our continent. It looks like the prof, I think, is from Kenya. Catherine, can you unmute and perhaps engage him on that?
So herd immunity, I think, is something which has been under debate for quite some time now. And but from where I sit as an epidemiologist, I think it's a risky strategy to take, because for herd immunity to be effective, it means that you've taken away from the general population the number of people who are called susceptible, that they can actually get the virus. And the only way you take out people from the susceptible pool is because they've been infected and they are immune, because when you get the virus, most viral infections elicit some kind of immune response. So you are less likely to get infected again by the same virus, or you vaccinate them. But you have to have so many of them so that any other person who is sick does not have enough people to pass the virus on. And so for many other viral infections, things like measles, you need 80% of the pool of people who are susceptible to be, to have herd immunity for it to be effective as a strategy. So for COVID-19, what has been estimated is that you need about 60 to 70% of the population to be immune, having been infected, so that then the epidemic sort of dies off. So other than vaccination, there's hardly any other examples in history where herd immunity has been an effective strategy, because herd immunity has only been achieved mostly through vaccination. So the danger with pursuing herd immunity as a strategy is because by the time you get to 60% of your population being infected, even though you take 1% of that population getting the severe cases and dying, that is still a huge amount of people. So there are few countries in the world that have been explicit about this herd immunity strategy. Sweden is one of them. And actually today I was reading that there's actually going to be an inquiry to investigate how they actually ended up where they ended up. Because Sweden, with all its resources, with its systems, with its healthcare system that is amongst the best in the world, has almost, in some instances, about 5 times the number of people who have died, 1,000, compared with its Scandinavian neighbors. So herd immunity seems attractive, but in the end, it's a very difficult choice to make for any public health professional or can't pursue this path, because medium-term implications are too great.
Thank you. Mausi, I have one for you from Laura Pawson. I've heard people say that for the first time ever, they feel the AU is finally an organization to be proud of because of its response to COVID-19. I'd love to hear what the panel has to say about the AU in terms of its response to COVID. You're muted. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think I agree with you to some extent that in the face of this pandemic, the AU has been upfront in guiding government. How much of that guidance is, accepted and implemented by governments is a totally different thing. Not just the AU, the political institution, but the African Commission for Human and People's Rights has been very clear, to spotlight for countries what issues around the right to health, around the right to economic palliatives, but also spotlighting the impact and the need for governments to take extra measures to protect vulnerable groups like migrants, refugees, women, asylum seekers, but also people in institutions like people in prison, those who cannot help themselves, who are forced to remain within the location. They help to set the standards and to reinforce that message very often to government. But in terms of, how much they could have helped to pull resources together. I mean, again, I take the point that, it's an unusual situation. It's one that, even though Africa has had, I'm not a health expert, so pardon me, Catherine, if I modest some of this. We've had, endemic diseases. We've had a couple of outbreaks of, but nothing as big and as widespread as this pandemic, at least not in the recent, decades. And so they really had no template to copy from. And so what the African Union, I think, could have done to help national governments, its parties, its state parties, was to, one, harness the resources that is available elsewhere, and then help them to distill that into something that is fitting and implementable for the nuances of the context that we have in Africa. One, where you have one, we know that African police and law enforcement are historically abusive. I've said this earlier. The one thing that shouldn't have happened was to give the powers, and some of these powers are so vague as to be, open to all kinds of interpretations, and that's exactly what we have seen, to give these wide powers to the same abusive forces without any form of reform. So that shouldn't have happened. It should, I mean, some countries and some localities have introduced civilian-led, enforcement kind of measures, but not bringing in the police. I feel that the African Union could have done a lot more in sending that message to African governments, but also helping them to put the policies together in consultation with the health and economic experts. That's the gap that I think was missing, and I think many African countries were left to themselves, even in accessing the global market for personal protection equipment. They really had very little help in that respect, or even for testing. I think that the AU could have done a lot more, but yeah, I will give it to them. Setting the standards and passing the message, reinforcing the message about human rights was key from them at this time.
Thank you very much. Great ideas there. I've also thought that the WHO leadership of Dr. Matshidiso has been Moeti, has been fabulous, and of Dr. Michael Yao as well. Really excellent to watch in action. Gilad, a question for you from Arya Carijo. How can we stimulate the sociological imagination so that citizens in Africa can connect their day-to-day lives to the system deficiencies and the leadership failures? So Arya says, what is scary is we'll move to the next crisis, be it flood, be it famine, the next virus, with zero resilience dividend from COVID-19. And you spoke about the social comorbidities, which really have revealed themselves like X-rays. What's your thought on that, on how we might use this moment as a, what Arundhati Roy called the pandemic as a portal to something different?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that's a really useful point, because I think that this is just the tip of the iceberg. If we think about both future health crises, but also the looming impact of climate breakdown, with parts of Africa being climate hotspots, we really will see significant crises of this nature moving forward. And so we do need to understand how restructuring of our economies need to be undertaken in a way which makes them resilient, right? I think that there's a number of things which we obviously need to do at each local level, but we also, and this touches on the point of the AU raised previously, need to consider these things on an international level also. What we need to see, for instance, now is increased fiscal transfers from rich countries to poor countries, both through various grants, through the IMF SDRs facilities. What we need to see is a global wealth tax. And what we, and we have to make sure that there's an equitable redistribution of resources to lower income countries to be able to actually handle this. There's been good work done, for example, on debt cancellation as another means of transfer. And then, of course, we need to look at the local level and to understand what it is which makes our societies be able to function to handle these. And that means a recentering of public provisioning, moving away from a logic of privatization, of private sector provisioning, seeing a large-scale investment in social sectors in healthcare. It means a rethinking of how we think about unpaid care work, social reproduction. We've seen that it is women who have really borne the brunt of the extra care work needed in these moments. We need to think about how the productive structures of our economy are altered so that they aren't reliant perhaps on the types of global value chains which have all ground to a halt now. And so yes, there's an absolute crucial reimagining of the structural socioeconomic DNA of our societies, so that we can both avoid and also mitigate when crises like this hit.
Thank you. So Catherine, many questions for you here. From Evelyn, lockdown was supposed to buy time to prepare the actual healthcare arrangements, the beds, the ICU wards, testing, tracking. Do you have a sense if that's happening? We locked down hard and we locked down early, and we've heard of the detrimental effects of those, but has this important banking work been done so that as we hit the surge, we have those facilities ready?
I think two answers to that. The first answer is that if you look at what has happened in countries like Vietnam, in Kerala state, in India, in countries like South Korea, a surge is not inevitable.
Okay.
And New Zealand, for instance, a surge is not inevitable. So a country can decide that they are going to do everything possible so that they nip, the transmission in the bud, and you never get to the point where you need hundreds and thousands of ICU beds. That's one response. The second response, and actually you can see differences if you look at the East African countries, what Rwanda and Uganda has done, they were trying to avoid a surge at all costs. Kenya seems to be more, I think very early on, they seem to have been more expecting that a surge was inevitable. So their response compared to the neighboring countries, it was different. And actually you can look at the numbers and you see that the Kenyan numbers are way higher than all the neighboring countries. And perhaps they expected that the surge was inevitable. So there've been some preparations. All the countries have done what they can. But of course, just this week, we had Kenya saying that they are not prepared for this number of cases. And they actually released guidelines for home management, which is also a set of cases, COVID cases are mild, and they don't need admission, they don't need oxygen, they don't need ICU beds and all that. So I think the results have been mixed. The countries have tried, but perhaps they've not reached the stage that is optimal. But from what I'm seeing, this is something which is going to be long and drawn out. So it's possible that the countries still have time to prepare for the surge if and when it materializes.
What's your sense, Catherine, of how that surge is going to move through our continent and when we should be over the peak of it? And then can I just add a question from Sadiq Railoon? He says that we are living in a time where you can expect more and more of these pandemics. And I think that's about right from what we've seen. He says, what behavioral human traits need to be emphasized in order that we may cope with these as they come?
So I'll take the first question about the surge, when we can expect it. You see, when people are making projections about things, there are so many variables in these predictive models. And as long as you alter some of those variables, things might change. But having said that, when you look at the rate of community transmission, when you look at those numbers which are being released on the regular, the most critical metric actually is how many cases are coming from the community. Because every community case that you get where you cannot trace where this person got COVID from indicates that there are many more other cases that you don't know. And if you assume that every other case that you don't know is likely to pass it on to other people, then it gives you a sense of what is possible. So when I look at a country like Kenya, Kenya is now at around 2,000, more than 2,000 cases. I think they're around 2,600 or 2,500. Moving from 0 to 800 took about 6 weeks. Moving from 800 to 10,000 can take 6 weeks as well, because every new case generates additional cases. So I can't say exactly when this is going to happen, but the rate at which the community transmission is happening in Kenya means that things are going to get worse before they get better. Maybe 10,000 cases is not an impossibility, but when you compare with the other countries like Rwanda and Kenya, they seem to have much, much, much less community transmission. So for them, getting to 10,000 cases may never happen. So it's not, and everything depends on what Kenya decides to do now and the next few weeks, because they can tighten the restrictions, they can, they can close up more geographies. Now it's just Nairobi and Mombasa. So there are many unknowns, and any of these variables being changed can actually, alter the trajectory that the pandemic is taking within these countries. Going back to the question about that pandemics are going to be a common feature of the world can I go ahead?
Yes.
So the question about pandemics, I was reading something about resilience, and something which struck me is that the system is the one that is able to maintain its core function. And I think the COVID-19 crisis is unprecedented, and it has provided an opportunity for countries to figure out how do you deal with something like COVID and still maintain your core functions. Because Ebola is not a good example. Ebola used to be restricted. It happens in small geographies. It doesn't affect more than 3 countries at a time. So COVID is different, and I think it's an opportunity to actually prepare better for future pandemics, where you start figuring out, if we get a pandemic like COVID, how do we differentiate services, for instance, and say COVID hospitals are these and the other hospitals are not COVID? How do we differentiate which healthcare workers perhaps deal with COVID and who they get a pandemic like COVID, how does that not COVID? I think it's really an opportunity, at least from the healthcare system perspective, you start figuring out, if we get this and the other hospitals are not COVID, how to maintain their core function while at the same time maintaining the COVID. So building systems, I think, as we move forward, can't be the something that needs to happen quite quickly.
Catherine,
because I think, as everybody sees, pandemics are somewhere at the same time, maintaining as everybody to deal with, not just now, but in the near future.
Thank you, Catherine. There's lots of questions for you. So perhaps for the last round, you could just try and turn your video off, because the sound was in and out. Mausi, I'd like to come to you now. May, you spoke at the top of your opening about us also experiencing a human rights pandemic, and I'd like you to sketch for us what that looks like. Is it just the security force violence that's top of mind for you, or is it also the socioeconomic rights, the absence of systems of social security, the hunger that we've seen almost everywhere and almost immediately? And then a question from one of our guest tonight is, what are the options for civilian policing and civilian army patrols? It felt to be in South Africa like our police and our army hadn't really changed since apartheid days. They hadn't been taught to be civilian services. Thanks, Mausi.
Okay. So, the range of human rights abuses that have been occasioned by the lockdown measures, flow all the way from the spread of the disease itself. It's the lack of access to quality healthcare. Because the lack is, it stems from inability to afford the costs. So right from the get-go, it's that problem of deep poverty and inequality across Africa. Almost every country has deep inequality and deep poverty problems. So from the beginning, you have this existing gap in what people can access. And then there is the way that some of the lockdown measures have been implemented that has been discriminatory. So I'll give you the example of South Africa. South Africa very early on is one of the richer countries, like Nigeria in Africa, was able to implement some, welfare packages for its most vulnerable communities, but it excluded migrants, excluded, people who are asylum seekers. It excluded some people whose refugee status had not been completed. And so in that bucket of, migrants, asylum seekers, and migrants, you have even more people who are made more vulnerable for all kinds of reasons. So same-sex conduct, people who are LGBT traveling to South Africa, because South Africa, more than any other country in Africa, is a refuge for LGBT people, because the rest of Africa has about half of the countries around the world that criminalize same-sex conduct are African countries. And so you have many LGBT people migrating to South Africa, and so already made vulnerable by their lifestyle and, by the way that they are perceived, the hostility of the community. And then comes this pandemic. Many of them have no access to, well-paying jobs, or none at all, have no homes because they've been ejected. And then they are faced with this, and the government policy decidedly excludes them from this. The second example is from Kenya. Kenya at some point decided that it was a good idea to penalize and to stigmatize the infection itself. How did it do this? By arresting people who flout curfew and other lockdown measures and ordering them to go into mandatory quarantine at isolation centers that is facilitated. So you have to pay the cost for all of that. And so one, you're already stigmatized, even though you are not ill. So one, overwhelming the system, overwhelming the facilities with people who have not been tested, and they remain there for 14 days at their own cost. And so all of this, this definitely penalize poverty, penalize people who have, fewer access to, healthcare or to take care of themselves. And then you have, like I said earlier, the policing part of it. The policing part of it is the challenge with it is that there is absolutely no accountability for police abuses. In very few cases, especially now with civilian attention and vigilance and recording of these abuses as they happen and making a report. So those are the two key elements that sometimes are lacking and allows the police to get away with it. When the public outcry, reaches a crescendo, authorities are forced to respond. We've seen the example of what is happening in the United States, but it's happening here, right here in Africa, even within the context of COVID itself. So many number of cases that have been reported to us, directly reported to partners, of people whose rights have been abused, women who have been raped. So there is also opportunistic human rights abuses taking place by security forces during curfews, when people have no opportunity to leave their homes to go report. So people dressed in military and police uniforms are breaking into homes, raping women. We've recorded this in Guinea-Conakry. We've recorded it in Rwanda. And so what happens, we confront the authorities with this, and they deny it because, hardly, especially those types of crimes like rape, where who would be recording rape, except it was done publicly and in daytime. And so the likelihood that there would be no accountability for that becomes a real challenge, because impunity only breeds many more abuses. If I can quickly go to the question on community policing, it's a concept that has existed for many years, not properly implemented in Africa, but in some communities it actually works well. What doesn't work well is sometimes what they call vigilantism. Vigilantism, especially when it is armed, again breeds human rights abuses, because there is no accountability mechanisms, embedded in those programs. And so vigilantes come in commit abuses, and because they have the law behind them, or at least law enforcement for whom they act as a buffer between them and the people, more abuses occur. So what we need is a proper system with adequate early consultation between local communities to identify their needs and how they can hold, you know, and it's a mechanism for holding the members of the community policing or community awareness, whatever name we want to call them, accountable. Accountability is key.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mausi. So we're headed to round up in a few minutes. So I ask you to keep your answers quite tight. I want to end on my own one hopeful, wonderful story. The Canadian Surgeon General is in charge of the entire response there. And when told that she could get the army or the National Guard out onto the street, she said no. And a phrase you may have heard of, be calm, be safe, be kind, has become a real watchword, at which we saw some of that. Gilad, a last question of real hope to you here from somebody. People are saying it's the end of neoliberalism. Do you agree? I know that's a very long answer, but you quite tight.
I mean, I don't, unfortunately. Neoliberalism being obviously a period of ultra pro-market capitalism. I think that this highlights the structural weaknesses within the global and local economies which we have now. I think that there's no doubt it highlights how the cause of these viruses and their spread is rooted in those unequal systems, and it shows how the distribution of the pain and the impact is such based on the nature of those economic systems. But displacing those economic systems is not something which will fall from the sky for us. I think there's a strong, long, hard fight to be had. I think we need to articulate visions of alternatives. I think we need to try and dismantle carefully the ideas upon which the economic systems which we operate in rest. And I think this does offer the opportunity for us to work towards a just recovery, one which prioritizes the environment and people, one which tries to recalibrate power relationships in society so that it is like workers and the majority who have real say. But that's not going to happen for us. And at the same time, you're going to have people who would like to see a return to normal, and attempt to go from where we are now, even in a moment where governments have implemented the most extraordinary measures, and to try and roll those back and so that's a fight which we're all going to have.
Thank you, Gilad. Catherine, final question to you. Are you hopeful for a vaccine given the numbers of trials that we've seen, several of them on our continent?
I'm hopeful because I'm an optimist generally, and most of the trials that have advanced, they show promise. So from that perspective, I'm hopeful. From the perspective of global politics and supply chains, maybe not so much. It will take a huge undertaking to provide enough vaccines for everyone in the world. And African countries, being who we are probably at the lowest list of priorities in terms of how to manufacture enough for ourselves. So we have to depend on global solidarity to get a vaccine once it becomes available. But I think one other thing that we need to deal with as public health practitioners in Africa is to dispel the myth and disinformation about vaccines, especially the COVID vaccine. So even when a vaccine is available, people may not want to take it up. So there's a lot that still needs to be done. The vaccine is still a few months, maybe a year down the line. but that's not the end of it. That even though an effective vaccine is found, you know, getting it to the people on the ground may take longer than that. Over.
Thank you very much. Gilad, what is that? Is that your baby there? Thank you very much to Prof. Samir, to Evelyn, Laura, Sadiq, Nadia. Sorry I didn't get your questions, Evelyn, and to a lovely audience. Thank you everybody for lovely questions. Mary, back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion. I learned a lot, and I wanted to draw, I mean, lots of fascinating threads there, but certainly the human rights strand of the discussion and the human rights abuses that are being committed now under the pretext of COVID. We have a special project called Democracy Watch, which is looking exactly at those things. And if you want regular updates on that, you can sign up to our newsletter at opendemocracy.net/Corona Crackdown, and we'll put that in the chat as well. It's opendemocracy.net/Corona Crackdown. Thank you to all. It's my job to say that if you think that we need public interest journalism as part of the response to COVID and to help us facilitate how we build a better world now, but also long beyond this crisis, please do consider supporting our work, Open Democracy, which is support.opendemocracy.net/donate. We run these webinars every week, and we run them for free, and we hope that people from all over the world can join us. So please sign up if you'd like to find out more about the next session we have next week. We have Joe Stiglitz, and we have Ann Pettifor, and we have a number of leading global economists talking about exactly many of the issues we discussed today, how we build a more just, more equitable, more sustainable world after COVID. So please join us for that as well. Thank you to everyone who participated today. And I hope you have good, healthy and safe mornings, afternoons, evenings, depending on where in the world you are. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.